Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and welcome to my briefing on Chapter 12 of the Pinkham book, Django Unleashed. And Chapter 12 is called The Big Picture. This is really a summary chapter. There's a little bit of new information in it, and I'll try to point out where it is. But for the most part, uh, what's happened is that we've come to the end of part one of the text, where we've learned the core features. And the only thing that we've skipped so far is chapter 11, and we're going to do that out of sequence. Chapter 11, in terms of the application that they're building in the textbook, is a form, just a plain form without it being connected to the model. So that's an important skill to have. And they use that in order to create a contact page where you can send them email. So they also explore the features where you can automatically send email out of a Django application. The reason it did make sense for us at this point is that in our tutorial application, Easy University, all of our users are going to be logged in, okay, or they're not going to have access to our application. So they're not going, so we're going to know who they are. So they're not going to have to put a lot of information in about themselves for us to contact them. When we want to contact them, when they want to contact us, they'll just have to tell us, and we're going to know who they are. Okay, they're just going to tell us what the issue is. All right, and in order to do that, we need to do some things out of part two first. Okay, so apart from that, we're finished with part one of the book on the core features. So here's the things that we summarize. One, that the Django is inspired by model view controller architecture. Okay, and here's a real nice discussion here um, of how Django is inspired by model view controller, but it's really different. A bit different, and even goes on to say that some people who are Django fans like to describe Django in terms of model template view. Uh, and that's a nice discussion until he tells us that, well, he thinks that confuses people, so he's not really going to hang his hat on that either. I think the conclusion that he comes to, and the conclusion that I come to, is that um, because it was inspired by model view controller architecture, Django gets the benefit of this kind of separation of concerns into different parts of the architecture. And it's a little different than model view controller, but it's certainly still good, and certainly the Django people think better. And it's better to just kind of understand it for itself. Okay. Um, he begins with this diagram where he's showing kind of the architectural round trip from the user who's on their computer in their browser, um, and they send a request to the Django server, and it first comes into URL dispatch because we have to figure out which which page of the site to wake up, right? And how do we do that? Well, we use the URL patterns for that, urls.py. And then from there, it gets directed to a particular view. And of course, we've implemented them in views.py. And most of our views are class-based views. Um, and views are responsible for causing the response to happen, and then the response gets sent back to the client computer and gets displayed in the browser. So that's kind of the simple version. And of course, it doesn't have all the parts that we use. So then he goes on and shows us a more complex version that accounts for the parts that we've been using. And so we still have it. We still have that basic round trip with the requests coming in from the client's browser on their client computer and going through URL dispatch and then go into a particular view. And the view really controlling the bulk of the action, including the return of the response. Okay, but we have other parts. For instance, we have models. Okay, and the models interact with the relational database, right? And so what coordinates all of that activity? Well, the view. Okay, so we don't know what model we're working with until the view tells us so. Okay, likewise, once we're ready to send a response back, we're going to use a template. Okay, and we have these template files. Okay, and a template loader that loads the template files, and then and so those things are identified again by the view, and that causes a response page to be rendered and sent back to the browser. So this is a clear, big picture that includes the parts that we've been working with so far. And then he goes on and he shows us an even bigger version because we hadn't really identified forms. Okay. And we hadn't really talked about with the templates, we hadn't really talked about the context processors that interact with the template loader and the views and the template files. So here we've got more parts. Okay, we still have that pretty much that same old cycle. There's a little change here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the views, again, he draws the views in the center of this diagram because that's where the controlling action is going on in the view. Okay, and then we've got the models that interact with the database, and we've got forms that cooperate with the models. And what introduces the forms? Well, the view does. Okay, and then when we go to render a page of output, the more complete view has a combination of template files, a template loader, and context processors, all of which are kind of orchestrated again by the view, and then we send the response. He talks about here for the first time middleware, and he hasn't really given us a good example of middleware that we're going to use yet. But middleware is can be thought of as filtering code. So we have a request that's coming in from the browser. We can actually configure middleware parts that will somehow filter or transform the request on its way in. Okay. Or we could have the other way. We have a response that's going to the browser. Okay. And when it gets, just before it gets sent on its way, it goes back out through these. You can really think of them as filtering and transformation layers of middleware. And typically, they kind of work like a shell. So on the way in, they'll go A, B, C, D, and then on the way back out, they'll go D, C, B, A. Okay, they're typically two-sided processes. Okay, so we don't have any we don't have any examples that we're using so far, but we will see some before we're done with the course. Okay, and this is just a more realistic diagram of the Django architecture. Okay, and then when he gets down in the bottom, he's sort of over the course of this, he kind of does a review of all these parts and what they do. And then when he gets down to the bottom, he says, well, you're ready to build some stuff. We're going to learn some stuff in part 2, which in my course we do most of part 2, but not all. And then part 3, and we don't do part 3 in my course, but certainly part 3 is there for you to use. But he's saying before you do all that stuff, you ought to be able to begin to build some stuff. All right. And this is pretty good for people in my course because they have a project that they need to conceive of and build. And this is a place where you're going to have the skills to get all that done. So he's giving you some inspiration to do that. So that's it. It's really just a review, a big picture, and a little incentive to start to build things on your own, which I think is really timing appropriate for us. So that's it for chapter 12. I'm going to say bye until next time.